Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The night of the centennial full moon arrived in a way that felt like magic itself, with a stillness in the air that made Alara's skin tingle. She sat on the edge of the hill overlooking her family's farm, her legs dangling off the rocky ledge, the moonlight casting a silver glow across the fields below. The sky was clear, the stars faint and distant compared to the brilliant orb that hung above her. The moon seemed closer than ever before, almost within reach, and there was something different about its light tonight, something that made Alara's heart race, though she didn't know why. The village was quiet, as it always was on these nights. Most people had already turned in, but Alara had felt a pull, an irresistible urge to come here and watch the moon rise to its full glory. There were stories, of course. Old legends passed down through the generations about the moon goddess descending from the heavens on nights like this, choosing one among the people to receive her blessing. But those were just tales to scare children, weren't they? Alara smiled to herself. She wasn't a child anymore, and magic wasn't real. Not the way the old story said, and yet, there was something undeniably different about tonight. The wind picked up, cool and sharp, carrying with it the scent of distant pine and damp earth. Alara shivered, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. She should go home, she thought. The night felt too full of something she couldn't quite name. But before she could rise, a light breeze stirred the leaves at her feet, and she looked up. The moon had grown brighter, so bright it hurt to look at, like staring into the sun. Her breath caught in her throat as the silver light surrounded her, enveloping her whole body in a soft glow. It wasn't cold, as she'd expected. It was warm, gentle, like a comforting hand resting on her shoulder. Alara, a voice whispered, though no one was there. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice was soft, melodic, but it came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Panic rose in her throat, and she struggled to her feet, backing away from the ledge. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. "Alara," the voice whispered again, and this time, she could feel it, like a presence wrapping itself around her, invisible but undeniably there. Her legs wobbled, and she stumbled, dropping to her knees as the moonlight became blinding, the world disappearing in a sea of silver. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the light softened, and Alara gasped for breath, blinking against the stars. The hill was the same, the night unchanged, but she was not. She could feel it, deep in her bones, like something new had awakened inside her. The voice lingered in her mind, fading but leaving a promise behind. "You are chosen." Her hands trembled as she reached for the ground, needing something solid to ground herself. But when her fingers brushed the earth, it was not the cool dirt she expected but something softer, warmer. A faint glow surrounded her hands, silvery tendrils of light spiraling around her fingers. She pulled back with a gasp, watching in shock as the light faded. She glanced up at the moon, now hanging high in the sky, still brilliant but no longer overwhelming. What had just happened? The following days passed in a blur, though Alara barely spoke a word of what had happened on the hill. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear, and she kept to herself as much as possible, hoping no one would notice the change in her. But the strange power she'd felt that night hadn't disappeared. It was still there, beneath her skin, waiting, and every so often, it would slip out. The first time had been when she was tending the sheep with her father. One of the ewes had caught its leg in a tangle of wire, and Alara had rushed over, heart pounding as she tried to free the animal. Her fingers brushed the sheep's wool, and suddenly, the wire snapped apart as if cut by invisible scissors. Both she and the ewe had stared at each other in shocked silence. Alara had run then, her heart racing, terrified of what was happening to her. She didn't know what it was or how to control it, and that scared her more than anything. The moonlight, the voice, it all felt like a dream she couldn't wake from. At night, she lay awake, staring up at the ceiling of her small room, wondering what the moon goddess wanted from her. She had heard the voice, had felt the power, but why her? She was no one, just a farmer's daughter. Why would a goddess choose her? But it wasn't just the strange power or the dreams that haunted her. There were rumors in the village, rumors of strange figures seen near the edges of the forest, figures cloaked in darkness, watching. Elara had caught glimpses of them herself, shadowy forms that lingered just at the edge of her vision, disappearing when she turned to look. She told no one, but the unease grew with each passing day. Then, one night, the shadows came closer. It was late, the village silent save for the occasional bark of a dog or the rustle of wind through the trees. Elara had just fallen into a restless sleep when she was jolted awake by a sound outside her window. At first, she thought it was the wind, but then she heard it again, a soft whisper, followed by the creak of footsteps. She sat up, her heart pounding in her chest, straining to hear. There, by the barn, a figure, dark and indistinct, moving slowly toward the house. She scrambled out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cold floor, and darted to the window. She pressed her face against the glass, eyes wide, searching the shadows. For a moment, she saw nothing, only the pale glow of moonlight on the fields. But then, a shape moved, tall and thin, wrapped in a cloak of black, its face hidden in shadow. Elara's blood ran cold. The figure stopped, turning its head slightly, as if it could sense her watching. And then, slowly, it raised a hand that was skeletal and twisted, the fingers long and pointed like claws. Fear gripped her, and she stumbled back from the window, her heart racing. Who were they? What did they want? She had heard stories of bandits and raiders, but this figure was different, wrong. There was something about it that filled her with dread. Elara, the voice whispered, the same voice she had heard on the hill, but this time, it was filled with urgency. Run. Her body moved before her mind could catch up. She grabbed her cloak and flung open the door, rushing into the night. The cold air hit her like a slap, but she didn't stop, her feet pounding against the dirt as she sprinted toward the barn, toward her family. Her father would know what to do. He could protect them, but when she reached the barn, she stopped short. The figure stood there, just beyond the door, its face still hidden, but its presence overwhelming. The air around it seemed to ripple with darkness, like a shadow come to life. Elara's breath caught in her throat, and she stumbled backward, her hand reaching instinctively for the pendant her father had given her earlier that day. The moon-shaped trinket felt warm against her palm, as though it were alive, pulsing with energy. The figure took a step forward. Elara, use the light, the voice urged, softer now, but filled with the same intensity. Elara's hands shook, but she clenched the pendant tighter, focusing on the faint glow she had felt before. She could feel it now, beneath her skin, a flicker of power just waiting to be unleashed. The figure moved again, faster this time, closing the distance between them. Panic surged through her, and without thinking, she raised her hand, shouting out in fear. The light burst forth from her fingers, blinding and pure, striking the figure full in the chest. The force of it sent the dark figure stumbling backward, the shadows around it scattering like smoke in the wind. Elara gasped, her hand dropping to her side, her chest heaving with exertion. The figure dissolved into the night, leaving only the quiet rustle of the trees and the soft glow of the moon above. She stood there, trembling, as the reality of what had just happened sank in. She had used the power of the moon goddess. But instead of relief, all she felt was terror. If the shadows had come for her once, they would come again. And next time, she might not be able to stop them. with a heavy heart, she turned back to the house. She couldn't stay here, not if it meant putting her family in danger. The moon goddess had chosen her for a reason, and it was time she found out why. Elara barely slept that night, haunted by the shadows that had crept too close to her home. The next morning, she packed a small bag and bid her family a tearful goodbye, offering them no explanation beyond the fact that it was safer for them if she left. Her father, though clearly troubled, placed his rough hands on her shoulders and gave her a simple pendant, moon-shaped, just like the one she'd been holding the night before. "It's been passed down in our family for generations," he said quietly. "Maybe it will bring you guidance." Elara's throat tightened as she slipped the pendant over her neck, feeling its familiar warmth against her chest. She hugged her father one last time, then turned away, setting off on a journey with no clear destination, only the knowledge that the answers lay somewhere beyond the familiar fields of her childhood. Somewhere, the moon goddess was waiting to guide her. She traveled for days, crossing open fields and dense forests, always feeling as though she was being watched, always keeping one hand close to the pendant and the other near the knife at her waist. Each night, the moon rose high above her, and with it, a surge of power pulsed within her veins. She experimented cautiously with it, calling forth small bursts of light to illuminate her path or move a rock from her way. The magic was still raw and uncontrollable, but she could feel it growing stronger with each passing night. It wasn't long before she began to hear rumors of a dark force moving through the land, of towns left in ruin, their inhabitants vanished or worse. The night fallen, people whispered, a name that sent shivers down her spine. An ancient cult, one that had once been banished from the world, now seemed to be returning, drawn by the power of the moon goddess's chosen one. One night, as she sat by her small campfire, her heart heavy with the burden of it all, she heard a rustling in the bushes behind her. Elara leapt to her feet, her hand instinctively going to the pendant as she prepared to summon her light. But before she could release it, a man stepped into the clearing. He was tall, lean, and battle-worn, with a sword strapped to his back and a wary look in his eyes. "Easy," he said, raising a hand in peace. "I'm not here to hurt you." Elara didn't relax her stance, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. He looked like a mercenary, someone who had seen too many battles and trusted too few. "Who are you?" The man stepped closer to the fire, his features coming into focus in the soft glow. "Name's Kalen," he said. "And you're the one the Nightfallen are hunting, aren't you?" Elara's heart skipped a beat. How did he know? Was he one of them? She took a cautious step back, her fingers still poised over the pendant. Kalen seemed to sense her fear and shook his head. "I'm not one of them. I've been tracking them for weeks. They leave destruction in their wake, and they're after something, someone, with a power unlike any other." His gaze met hers, sharp and probing. "That's you, isn't it?" Elara didn't answer, but the silence that followed spoke louder than words. Kalen sighed, rubbing a hand over his face as if weighing his next words carefully. "Look, I've seen what they can do. If you're the one they're after, you need help." Elara hesitated. She had been running from the Nightfallen, trying to understand her own powers, but now, faced with this stranger's offer, she wasn't sure if she could trust him. Still, something about Kalen's presence reassured her. There was a weight to his words, an understanding that he, too, had seen the darkness creeping across the land. "They'll keep coming for you," Kalen said quietly. "You won't be able to stop them alone." Elara's grip on the pendant tightened, the warmth from it pulsing through her skin. She had felt so alone since the night of the full moon, but now, with Kalen standing before her, offering his help, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps she didn't have to face this journey alone. "All right," she said at last, her voice steady but guarded. "But if you betray me, I won't hesitate to fight back." Kaelin gave a wry smile. "Fair enough. Let's just try to keep each other alive, all right?" With that, the two of them set off together, bound by the common goal of survival and the growing threat of the night fallen. Kaelin led them through the wild lands, his knowledge of the terrain proving invaluable as they avoided ambushes and hidden traps. Elara, in turn, began to trust him more as the days passed, though she never let her guard down completely. They trained together, Kaelin helping her learn to fight with her newfound magic while Elara refined her control over the light that now surged through her. As the nights grew longer, Elara's dreams became more vivid. Each time, she saw the moon goddess, her form glowing with an ethereal light as she stood in a temple surrounded by towering pillars. The visions grew more urgent, the moon goddess's voice guiding her toward the temple, a place that Elara now knew she had to find. But as they drew closer to the mountains where the temple was said to be hidden, the night fallen began to close in. Their numbers grew larger, and their attacks more frequent. Kaelin fought alongside her, his sword flashing in the darkness, but even with his skill and her magic, they were barely holding their own. One night, as they camped in a secluded valley, Elara sat by the fire, watching Kaelin clean his sword. The flames flickered in the cool night air, casting long shadows that danced across the ground. "They're not going to stop, are they?" she said softly, more to herself than to him. Kaelin looked up from his task, his expression somber. "No. They won't." Elara sighed, her heart heavy. She had come so far, learned so much, but the weight of her destiny was crushing. The night fallen were relentless, and every day brought them closer to the final confrontation she wasn't sure she was ready for. "What if I fail?" she whispered, her voice trembling with the fear she had tried so hard to hide. "What if I can't control this power?" Kaelin sheathed his sword and came to sit beside her. "You won't fail," he said quietly. "You've already come this far, Elara. You're stronger than you know." His words offered some comfort, but the doubts still gnawed at her. She glanced down at the pendant, feeling its weight against her chest. The moon goddess had chosen her, but for what? To fight a battle she wasn't prepared for? To face enemies that seemed undefeatable? "I've lost people before," Kaelin said, breaking the silence. "People I cared about. I've seen what the night fallen are capable of. But I've also seen what you can do, Elara. You have a chance to stop them. To save everyone." Elara swallowed hard, the enormity of it all pressing down on her. But Kaelin's presence was steady, and she drew strength from it. The next morning, they reached the base of the mountains, the craggy peaks towering above them, shrouded in mist. Elara's dreams had led them here, to the Temple of the Moon, where she hoped to find the answers she so desperately needed. But as they made their way up the narrow path that wound through the mountains, the air grew colder, and a sense of foreboding settled over them. They were close now, and with every step, Elara felt the power within her growing stronger, more focused. She could feel the pull of the temple, the energy that radiated from it, calling her forward. By the time they reached the temple's entrance, the sun had set, and the sky was painted with the deep hues of twilight. The temple stood before them, ancient and magnificent, its pillars reaching toward the sky like the arms of the moon goddess herself. Moonlight bathed the temple in a soft glow, and the air hummed with the same energy Elara had felt the night she was chosen. But they weren't alone. From the shadows, the night fallen emerged, their dark forms slipping through the mist like phantoms. At their head was Malvar, his eyes burning with a malevolent fire, his voice cold and mocking. "You've come a long way, girl," he sneered, his gaze locking onto Elara. "But it ends here." Ilara's heart raced as she stepped forward, her hand gripping the pendant tightly. Kalen drew his sword, standing at her side, ready to face whatever came next. Malvar raised his hand, and the shadows around him writhed like living things. You think you can stand against me? Against the power of the Night Fallen? Ilara's pulse quickened, but she stood her ground, feeling the light within her growing stronger with every breath. This was it, the moment she had been preparing for. The moon goddess had chosen her, not just to wield the power, but to protect the world from the darkness that Malvar and his followers sought to unleash. The final battle had begun.